The click came before the meaning did a small hard sound of metal closing around my wrist in the middle of a bright open terminal where sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling glass and painted everything in clean sharp lines. I remember the light, first how it bounced off polished tile, how it caught the silver edge of the handcuffs, how it made everything look too clear to deny, and for a second I thought maybe this was a mistake that would correct itself if I just stayed still, if I just breathed. The right way. People kept moving around me, rolling carry-ons, wheels rattling in uneven rhythms over the floor, announcements echoing overhead about departures to Chicago, to Dallas, to Los Angeles, voices layered over one another like a world that had no intention of stopping for me. But I could feel the shift, the subtle slowing, the way I started to turn, not all at once, but in pieces, a glance here, a pause there, until suddenly I was the center of something I never asked to be part of. "Ma'am, please stand still," the officer said, his voice controlled, practiced like he had done this 100 times before. I did not resist. I did not pull away. I let my shoulders settle. I let my hands stay open. I let the breath in my chest rise and fall like it belonged to someone else. And I watched my own reflection ripple faintly in the glass wall across from me, a woman in a simple jacket, worn sneakers, hair pulled back. Nothing about me loud enough to explain this moment, nothing about me that would tell them who I really was. The ticket was still in my left hand, creased slightly from where I had been holding it too tightly. Gate B24, boarding in less than 30 minutes, 3 months of double shifts, early mornings, late nights, cleaning floors that never stayed clean, just to stand here now under a sky of steel beams and sunlight, with a cold circle closing around my wrist. "Sir, there has to be some mistake," I said quietly, not loud, not pleading, just steady, because I had learned a long time ago that raising your voice only makes them hear something else. The officer did not look at me when he responded, "We need you to come with us, ma'am." His partner stood slightly behind him, watching, not angry, not kind, just certain, and that certainty moved faster than truth ever could. I could feel the air change again, thicker now, like something unspoken had already been decided around me. A woman near the security line leaned toward her husband and whispered something I could not fully hear, but I caught enough: the tone, the assumption, the quiet conclusion that required no evidence. A phone lifted somewhere to my right, the small red blinking on a screen, someone capturing a version of me they would never question. I lowered my eyes, not in shame, but in focus. The pattern of the tile beneath my shoes, the faint scuff marks, the reflection of overhead lights stretching long and thin across the floor, details that kept me grounded when everything else tried to pull me into something smaller than I was. The metal felt cool against my skin, not painful, just present a reminder that control can be taken without force, that judgment can arrive before words ever do. I inhaled slowly, held it for a count, then let it go, the way I was taught years ago, when staying calm was not optional, it was survival. If this moment feels familiar to you, if you have ever stood in a place where people decided who you were before you could speak, then you already understand what it means to stay still when everything inside you wants to explain. I did not look at them again, not the officers, not the crowd, not the cameras, because I knew something they did. Not this moment was not the whole story, and somewhere just beyond the noise, just beyond the assumption, something else was about to step into the light. They started walking me forward, not fast, not rough, just steady, like this was routine, like I had already been placed into a category that required no further thought. And I matched their pace without hesitation, because I had learned that control sometimes looks like compliance when the alternative is being misunderstood. Even more, the terminal stretched ahead, wide and bright sunlight cutting across the floor in long, clean beams that warmed the side of my face as we passed through them, and I focused on that warmth, on something real, something that belonged to me instead of the weight around my wrist. The officer on my left adjusted his grip slightly, not tightening, not loosening, just confirming I was still there, as if I might disappear if he did not maintain contact. People parted without being asked, a subtle shift of bodies and bags like a current moving around a rock. Some looked directly at me, eyes sharp, curious. Others avoided me completely, their gaze dropping to their phones, to the floor, to anything that would keep them from being part of the moment. But they were all part of it, every single one of them. The quiet hum of the airport wrapped around us. Announcements continued in the same calm voice. Boarding groups now open, final calls approaching, as if time refused to acknowledge what was happening inside it. And for a second, I found myself counting steps, not because I was nervous, but because rhythm kept my mind clear. 1, 2, 3, for the same way I used to count under pressure when everything depended on staying grounded. The ticket was still in my hand, edges soft from. Use my thumb resting over the printed name Ava Brooks, the letters simple, ordinary, nothing about them explaining the weight of this walk, nothing about them telling anyone what those hands had done, where those feet had been, what those eyes had seen. I caught a glimpse of a child watching from near a row of seats, maybe 8 years old, his small fingers curled around the handle of a backpack, his expression not judgmental, not fearful, just curious, like he was trying to understand a story that had started before he arrived. And I held that image for a moment, because children see differently. They have not yet learned how quickly the world assigns meaning. Without asking questions, we turned past a row of glass panels, and I saw us reflected, 3 figures moving in sync, the officers upright, composed, and me in the center, not dragged, not resisting, just present. And for a brief second, I wondered what that reflection looked like to someone who did not know me, what story it told from the outside, what conclusion it offered. Without context, the answer came easily. It always does. She must have done something. That is how stories like this are written, in a place like this, with light this bright and floors this clean. The officer spoke again into his radio, his voice low, controlled, confirming something I could not hear entirely, just fragments. Location secured. Bringing her in. The words floated past me without weight, because I knew better than to hold on to language that was not meant for truth, only for process. My breathing stayed, even my shoulders relaxed, not out of surrender, but out of choice, because panic would only give them something to point at, something to justify what they had already decided. I remembered the early mornings, the smell of industrial cleaner, the hum of machines, the quiet work that goes unnoticed because it is not meant to be seen. And I thought about how invisible effort can be, until suddenly it is replaced by visibility of the wrong kind you never asked for, a kind that spreads faster than explanation ever could. We slowed as we approached a secured doorway, the kind that separates the public world from the controlled one, and I could feel the temperature shift, slightly cooler air brushing against my skin as the doors opened with a soft mechanical sound. And still I did not look back, not at the gate, not at the people, not at the path I had just walked, because whatever waited ahead was already unfolding, and I had a quiet certainty settling deeper in my chest, the kind that does not need to announce itself, the kind that knows this moment is only the surface of something far more precise, something that had not yet stepped into view but was already close enough to be felt. The door closed behind us with a soft sealed sound, and the noise of the terminal dropped away, like someone had turned down the volume on the world outside, leaving only the low hum of ventilation and the faint echo of footsteps against a smoother, quieter floor. The air felt cooler here, controlled, measured, like everything that happened beyond that threshold had already been decided long before anyone stepped inside. I lifted my head slightly, taking in the narrow hallway ahead, fluorescent lights running in a straight line above us, casting a pale, even glow that left no shadows to hide, in just clarity, just exposure. The officer on my left released his hold, but stayed close enough that the distance between us still felt intentional, not trust, just procedure. We moved forward again, past a row of secured doors, each marked with codes and labels that meant nothing to most people, but I recognized the structure, the pattern, the quiet order of a system designed to filter, to verify, to control. And I felt something shift inside me, not fear, not tension, something older, something steadier, a memory not of a place, but of a mindset where every step mattered, where awareness was not optional, it was survival. We reached a small room with glass on one side, not transparent, but tinted just enough to remind you that someone could be watching without being seen. The officer gestured toward a chair, simple metal legs, gray seat, functional, nothing more. I sat down without hesitation, placing my hands gently on the table in front of me, the metal around my wrists resting against the surface. With a faint sound that seemed louder in the quiet room, one of the officers stepped aside, speaking quietly into his radio again, words clipped, efficient, confirming details that still had not been offered to me directly. The other stood across from me, arms relaxed, but posture firm, his eyes finally meeting mine, not aggressive, not sympathetic, just certain, the kind of certainty that comes from believing the process is enough. Ma'am, we need to verify your identity, he said, and I nodded once, because I had expected that. I had been expecting something from the moment the first click sounded in the open terminal outside, something that would test not just who I was on paper, but who I was in their eyes. I slid the ticket forward across the table, the edge catching slightly against the surface before stopping between us. Ava Brooks, I said quietly, my voice even steady, the same way I had spoken before, because tone matters in moments like this more than volume, more than explanation. He picked it up, glancing down at it for only a second before setting it aside, as if the paper itself carried less weight than whatever assumption had already formed in his mind. "Do you have identification?" I reached slowly into my jacket pocket, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and placed my wallet on the table, opening it carefully, revealing the card inside. My name again, my photo, the same face sitting across from him, now unchanged, unhidden. He studied it longer this time, his gaze moving between the card and my face, back and forth, measuring, comparing, searching for something that would confirm what he already believed or challenge it. And I watched him do it without interruption, without defense, because I understood that this was not about facts, yet this was about perception, about whether the image in front of him aligned with the story he had already accepted. Outside in the sunlight, I could hear faint movement beyond the glass, a shadow passing briefly, then gone, the world continuing just out of reach, and I felt the quiet rhythm of my breathing settle deeper, slower, each inhale filling my chest, each exhale grounding me further into the chair, into the moment, into the truth that had not changed, even if everything around me had shifted. The officer set the identification down, his fingers resting on it for a brief second before pulling back. "There is a discrepancy," he said, and the word hung in the air heavier than it should have, because it was not specific, not clear, just enough to justify everything that had already happened and everything that might follow. I tilted my head slightly, not in confusion, but in focus, a small adjustment that allowed me to meet his eyes fully, to hold that gaze without challenge, without retreat. "Then please check again," I said softly, the same words as before, but now in a different room, under a different light, where the noise was gone and only intention remained, because somewhere beneath the layers of assumption, beneath the weight of process, beneath the quiet certainty in his posture, there was still a space where truth could enter, and I could feel it getting closer, not loud, not dramatic, just precise, like something aligning exactly as it was meant to. The word discrepancy did not echo, but it settled heavy in the space between us, like something placed there on purpose, something that did not need to be explained to be believed. I watched his hand rest briefly on my identification before he slid it a few inches away from himself. As if distance could make uncertainty feel more official, the other officer stepped closer, now not aggressively, but with that same quiet alignment that comes when two people share the same assumption without needing to say it out loud. I could feel their attention sharpen, not louder, not harsher, just more focused, like they were waiting for me to give them something to confirm what had already begun forming in their minds. And I stayed exactly where I was, my hand still resting on the table, the metal cool against my skin, my shoulders relaxed, my breathing steady, because I understood the moment for what it was, not an accusation, yet not a conclusion, but a narrow space where one direction would be chosen, and once chosen it would be very difficult to reverse. "What kind of discrepancy?" I asked, my voice calm, not defensive, not demanding, just clear. The officer exhaled slightly, not frustration, not impatience, just a controlled pause before answering. "Your name came up flagged in the system," he said, and the phrasing was careful, just vague enough to hold authority, without offering detail. "Flagged," a word that can mean everything or nothing, depending on who is using it. And why I let that settle for a second, not reacting immediately, because reaction often becomes the story instead of the truth. And I had no intention of becoming a story built on misunderstanding. I nodded once slowly. "Then please run it again," I said, the same request as before, but now there was a subtle shift in the air, not visible, not loud, just a faint tightening, like something unseen had begun to move beneath the surface. The officer glanced at his partner, a brief exchange of eyes, something unspoken passing between them, before he reached for a keyboard on the desk. Behind him, the soft clicking of keys filled the room. Measured, deliberate, each press marking time in a way that felt more precise than the ticking of any clock. I watched his reflection in the tinted glass as much as I watched him directly, the slight furrow in his brow, the small pause between entries, the way his posture adjusted just a fraction as new information appeared on the screen. I could not see what he saw, but I could read the shift in his body language, because I had learned long ago that people reveal truth in movement before they ever speak it aloud. The room remained quiet, no announcements, no rolling luggage, no distant conversations, just the hum of the system and the steady rhythm of my breathing. And in that silence, I felt something familiar, not fear, not even tension, but Recognition, the kind that comes when a situation begins to align with something you have experienced before, not the same place, not the same faces, but the same pattern, the same moment where perception begins to crack under the weight of fact. The officer stopped typing, his fingers hovering just above the keys for a brief second before lowering slowly to the desk. He leaned in slightly closer to the screen, then leaned back again, his jaw tightening. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest that something no longer fit as neatly as it had a moment ago. His partner shifted his stance, weight moving from one foot to the other, a small adjustment, but noticeable in a room this still. I kept my gaze steady, not challenging, not expectant, just present, because whatever was appearing on that screen did not need my reaction to be true. It was already there, already unfolding in its own time. The officer cleared his throat quietly, then reached for the radio at his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was still controlled, but there was a difference now, a subtle change in tone, less certainty, more precision. Requesting verification from TSA Supervision, he said, his words measured, each one chosen carefully, as if the situation had moved beyond something he could resolve alone. And for the first time since the door had closed behind us, the space shifted, not outward, not visible, but inward, like the center of the moment had just been relocated from assumption to confirmation. I felt it before anything else changed, a quiet certainty settling deeper in my chest, not relief, not satisfaction, just alignment, like a truth finally stepping into a place where it could be seen clearly. And I remained still, my hands resting on the table, my posture unchanged, my breathing even, because I knew something they did not yet fully understand. This moment was no longer moving in the direction they had expected, and whatever came next would not need to raise its voice to be undeniable. The room did not get louder, but it grew heavier, as if the air itself had started paying attention, the kind of shift that does not announce itself, but presses gently against your chest until you realize something has changed. The officer lowered his hand from the radio, and for the first time since I had been brought inside, he did not immediately look at me. Instead, his eyes stayed on the screen for a second longer, like he was reading something twice, making sure it did not rearrange itself into something easier to accept. His partner noticed it too. I could see it in the way his shoulders straightened just slightly, in the way his stance lost a fraction of that earlier certainty, not gone, just unsettled, like a foundation that had not cracked, but had begun to question its own balance. I remained still, my hands resting where they had been, the metal no longer cold, but not warm either, just present, like a detail that no longer defined the moment. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, steady and indifferent, casting the same, even glow across all of us, as if the room refused to take sides. The officer finally spoke, but not to me at first. He turned slightly toward his partner, lowering his voice just enough that the words blurred at the edges. I caught fragments. Verification code, clearance level, cross-reference, and even without seeing the screen, I understood what was happening, not because I knew the exact words, but because I recognized the rhythm of doubt replacing assumption. It always begins quietly like that, not with an apology, not with a correction, but with a pause, a recalculation, a moment where the story they were sure of starts to feel incomplete. He looked back at me, then really looked this time, not just at my face, but at my posture, my stillness, the absence of resistance, the absence of fear, and I could see the question forming behind his eyes, not spoken, not yet, but present. Who are you? He did not ask it out loud. Instead, he picked up my identification again, holding it a little longer, his thumb brushing lightly over the surface, as if the answer might reveal itself through touch rather than data. Ava Brooks, he repeated softer, now not for authority, not for confirmation, but for understanding. And I met his gaze without shifting, without filling the silence for him, because some realizations need space, they need room to arrive on their own without being pushed. The seconds stretched, not uncomfortably, just deliberately, like time had slowed down to give this moment the attention it required. Outside the glass, a shadow passed again, then another faint movement of people who had no idea what was unfolding, just a few feet away, separated by a wall that was not quite clear and not quite opaque, a boundary between two versions of reality, one built on assumption, the other beginning to reshape itself under the weight of truth. The officer exhaled slowly, then reached for the radio. Again, his voice, when he spoke, was different now, still controlled, still professional, but with a precision that had not been there before. This is Officer Hayes requesting immediate presence from TSA Supervisor Marcus Reed at Verification Room 3. His words landed clean, exact, no hesitation, and as the name settled into the air, something inside me aligned fully, not surprise, not relief, just confirmation, like a final piece sliding into place exactly where it was always meant to be. I did not move, I did not react outwardly, but my breathing deepened just slightly, my shoulders settling even more into stillness because I knew that name, I knew what it carried, what it represented. Not just authority, but recognition, and recognition changes everything, not in volume, not in force, but in clarity. The officer set the radio down carefully, this time, not abruptly, not casually, just with intention. His partner shifted again, a small step back, creating a fraction more space between us, a detail so subtle most people would miss it, but I did not miss it, because space like that is never accidental. It is given when something is no longer certain, when control begins to loosen, not because it has been taken, but because it no longer fits the moment. We waited, then no one speaking, no one moving beyond what was necessary. The hum of the lights, the faint sound of air moving through vents, the quiet presence of a truth that had not yet been spoken, but was already changing the shape of everything. And I sat there exactly as I had been from the beginning, calm, steady, unshaken, because this was never about proving who I was. This was about whether they were ready to see it. Time stretched in a way that felt almost physical, as if each second had weight and shape, pressing gently against the silence in the room. The hum of the fluorescent lights above became more noticeable, not louder, just clearer, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only the details that mattered. My breathing settled into a slow, steady rhythm, each inhale filling my lungs fully, each exhale controlled, measured the same way I had trained myself years ago, when stillness was not just calm, it was discipline. I lowered my gaze briefly to my hands resting on the table. The metal around my wrists no longer felt like an interruption, just an object, a temporary condition, something external that did not define anything internal. And for a moment I allowed my eyes to soften, not closing, not withdrawing, just shifting inward. The cool surface beneath my fingers, the faint vibration of the building through the table, the subtle movement of air across my skin, all of it grounding me in a space that was quiet in a way the outside world rarely allows. The officers did not speak, neither of them did, and that silence began to change shape. It was no longer filled with assumption, it was filled with waiting, the kind of waiting that comes when something larger than you is about to arrive, something that will either confirm everything or undo it completely. I heard footsteps beyond the door, at first faint, then clearer, a measured pace, not rushed, not hesitant, each step, even deliberate, approaching with a confidence that did not need to announce itself. And without lifting my head, I felt it before the door opened, that subtle shift in energy, the kind that comes when authority enters a room, not the loud kind, not the forceful kind, but the kind that settles into the space and rearranges it without effort. The handle turned with a soft, controlled motion, and the door opened, allowing a line of brighter light from the hallway to spill briefly across the floor before settling back into the room. The footsteps continued inside, then stopped. I lifted my eyes slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to meet the presence that had entered. And there he was, Marcus Reed, standing just inside the doorway, posture upright, uniform precise, every detail in place, not rigid, not performative, just exact. His gaze moved first to the officers, then to me, and in that brief movement something passed across his expression, not surprise, not confusion, something closer to recognition, but not fully formed. Yet the officers straightened, almost instinctively, not out of fear, but out of reflex, the kind that comes from years of responding to hierarchy. Without thinking, Officer Hayes spoke first, his voice measured, but no longer carrying the same certainty. "We have a discrepancy in the system and needed verification," he said, and the words felt smaller now, less anchored than they had before. Marcus Reed did not respond immediately. He stepped forward one pace, then another, his eyes returning to me and holding there for a fraction longer, this time studying, not judging, not searching, just seeing. And in that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, not because anything had been said, but because something was about to be understood. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands still resting on the table, my expression calm, because this was the moment where everything either stayed the same or shifted completely, and I had no need to rush it. Truth does not require urgency, it requires clarity, and clarity was already beginning to fill the space between us, like light finding its way through something that had been closed for too long. Marcus Reed took one more step into the room, and then stopped completely, his posture straightened, not stiff, but precise, as if something inside him had just aligned with what he was seeing. His eyes settled on me fully, now not scanning, not questioning, just recognizing, and in that stillness something shifted in a way that did not need explanation. Officer Hayes began to speak again, starting to repeat the situation, the discrepancy, the flag in the system. But his words slowed, then stopped on their own, because Marcus Reed had not taken his eyes off me, not even for a second. And then it happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through everything in the room. He raised his right hand in a clean, deliberate motion, fingers straight, palm angled exactly as it should be, a formal salute, the kind that is never given casually, the kind that carries weight, history, and respect. In a single silent gesture, the room changed instantly, not in sound but in meaning. The officers froze, not physically, but internally, their certainty halting mid-thought, their posture tightening, as understanding began to catch up with what they were seeing. I held his gaze steady, not surprised, not overwhelmed, just present, because I recognized it too, not the gesture itself, but what it stood for, the acknowledgement of something earned, something lived, something that cannot be reduced to a name on a screen or a line in a system. Marcus Reed lowered his hand slowly. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but carried a depth that filled the room. Without effort, ma'am, he said, not as a question, not as a command, but as recognition. And then he turned slightly toward the officers, his expression composed, but no longer neutral. You are detaining someone with federal clearance level access and prior military command training. His words were measured, each one landing with quiet precision, not sharp, not accusatory, just undeniable. Officer Hayes blinked once, the first visible break in his composure, his gaze moving quickly from Marcus Reed to me and back again, as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. I did not move, I did not speak. I let the moment settle, because this was not about correcting them, this was about allowing them to see clearly for the first time. Marcus Reed stepped closer to the table, his eyes briefly dropping to the metal around my wrists, then lifting again, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something steadier, something that carried both authority and restraint. Remove the restraints, he said simply, and there was no hesitation. This time, no pause, no need for clarification. The officer moved forward, quickly unlocking the metal with a small, precise motion, the sound of it releasing, softer than it had been when it closed, but somehow heavier in meaning. The weight lifted from my wrists, but I did not pull my hands away immediately. I kept them resting on the table for a second longer, feeling the absence of pressure, the return of something that had never really been taken, but had been temporarily restricted. The officers stepped back, now not dramatically, not apologetically, just enough to create space, real space, the kind that acknowledges a shift without needing to name it. Marcus Reed straightened slightly, his gaze returning to me with a quiet respect that did not need to be spoken further, and in that moment the entire room had changed, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood. The story they had believed was no longer holding, and the truth had stepped forward without raising its voice, without forcing its way in. It had simply arrived, and everything else had moved around it to make room. The absence of the metal around my wrists did not rush through me, it did not spark relief or release, it settled quietly, like something returning to where it had always belonged. I lifted my hands slowly, not to inspect them, not to react, just to feel the air against my skin again, the subtle freedom of movement that had never truly left me, but had been momentarily interrupted, and I rested them back on the table. For a second longer, grounding myself in the stillness that now filled the room. Marcus Reed remained where he stood, his presence steady, not dominating, not withdrawing, simply anchoring the space in a way that made everything else align around it. Officer Hayes cleared his throat softly, the sound small in a room that had grown too precise for unnecessary noise. His eyes moved to me, then away, then back again, searching for something to say that would match what had just unfolded. But words like that do not arrive easily, not when certainty has been replaced by realization. We apologize, ma'am, he said finally, the sentence careful, measured, each word placed with intention, but carrying the weight of something larger than the phrase itself. It was not just an apology for the moment, it was an acknowledgement of the distance between what was assumed and what was real. I met his gaze briefly, not holding it, not avoiding it, just enough to let the moment pass through without resistance, without extension. I nodded once, a simple motion, not dismissing, not accepting in any formal way, just allowing the moment to exist without adding anything to it, because some things do not need to be prolonged, they need to be understood. and then released. Marcus Reed stepped slightly to the side, his attention shifting to the officer, his tone calm but firm. Ensure her clearance is updated across all checkpoints immediately, he said, and the instruction carried the kind of authority that does not raise its voice, it does not need to. The officer nodded, quickly moving toward the system, again his movements more deliberate, now more careful, as if each action needed to be exact. The other officer stepped back further, creating space that had not been there before, space that felt different now, not controlled, not measured, just respectful. I reached for my identification card, still resting on the table, sliding it back into my wallet with a smooth, practiced motion, then picked up my ticket, the paper slightly creased, but intact, my name still printed clearly across it, unchanged, unaffected by everything that had just happened. I stood slowly, not abruptly, not cautiously, just with intention, feeling the balance of my body settle fully again. My shoulders relaxed, my posture aligned. The room seemed smaller now, not physically, but in importance, like its purpose had already been fulfilled and no longer needed to hold me. Marcus Reed turned toward the door, opening it with the same controlled motion as before, allowing the brighter light from the hallway to spill in once more, and I stepped forward past him, not rushed, not hesitant, just moving as I had intended to from the beginning. The hallway beyond felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I no longer carried the weight of being observed in the same way. The officers remained behind me, their presence no longer pressing, no longer defining, and as I walked I could feel the quiet shift in the air, the subtle recalibration of a moment that had begun one way and ended another, not with force, not with confrontation, but with recognition, the kind that does not need to be explained, because once it is seen it cannot be unseen. And I continued forward, my steps steady, my breathing, even the sound of my shoes against the floor, returning to a rhythm that belonged only to me, as the world beyond the door waited exactly where I had left it, but no longer looking at me the same way. I stepped back into the terminal, and the sound returned, first rolling suitcases, voices layered over announcements, the steady rhythm of movement that had never truly stopped, only faded for a moment while I was somewhere else, and the sunlight met me again through the glass, wide and bright, stretching across the floor as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not paused just long enough to reveal something most people never see. I walked forward at the same pace as before, not faster, not slower, my ticket held lightly in my hand, my identification resting where it belonged, everything in its place, and yet nothing quite the same. The people around me moved as they always do, some in a hurry, some distracted, some unaware, but a few looked up as I passed, not with curiosity, not with assumption, but with something quieter, something closer to recognition, not of who I was, but of what they had just witnessed, even if they could not fully name it. I reached the security checkpoint again, and this time the space opened without hesitation. The officer there glanced at the screen, then at me, his posture shifting, just slightly, not exaggerated, not forced, just enough to acknowledge what had already been confirmed. I placed my belongings in the bin, my hands steady, my movements simple and precise, the same way they had always been, because nothing about me had changed, not before, not during, not after. The only difference was what others had learned to see. I stepped through the scanner, the soft hum of the machine passing over me, without interruption, without delay, and when I emerged on the other side, the world felt exactly as it should have from the beginning, open, clear, and undisturbed. I gathered my things, adjusted my jacket, and continued toward my gate, each step carrying the same quiet rhythm that had guided me through everything before. I passed the same rows of seats, the same glass walls, the same bright reflections on polished floors, but now there was no weight attached to those details, no sense of being watched or measured, only presence, only movement, only forward. And as I walked, I thought about how easily a moment can be shaped by assumption, how quickly a story can form without asking a single question, how often people decide who you are based on what they expect to see instead of what is actually there. And I understood something that had been true long before today, but had revealed itself more clearly now. Kindness is not weakness, patience is not surrender, and dignity does not need permission. It does not depend on who recognizes it or when it is acknowledged. It exists on its own, steady and unshaken, even when everything around it tries to define it differently. I reached my gate just as boarding began, the line forming in an orderly curve, people stepping forward one by one, each carrying their own destination, their own reasons, their own unseen stories, and I took my place among them, not above, not apart, just present like everyone else, because that is what I had always been, a person moving through a world that does not always pause to understand, but sometimes if only for a moment it learns. I handed my ticket to the agent. She scanned it and looked up, meeting my eyes briefly. With a small nod, nothing more was needed. I stepped onto the jet bridge, the light shifting again from bright open sun to a softer, enclosed glow, and as I moved forward I did not look back, not at the checkpoint, not at the room, not at the moment that had tried to define me before it understood me, because what mattered was not what had happened, it was what remained, and what remained was simple, clear, and unshaken. You do not need to prove your worth to a world that has not yet learned to see it. You only need to carry it with you until it does.